All right. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series, Israel Insider. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined today by Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's office in Israel, joining us each week to give us a brief update on the top events currently going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will speak for 15 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A from the audience. And if you'd like to ask a question, you can do so by using the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Afnaf, and good evening from Israel. There's really only one place to start tonight, and that's the discussions over Iran. 8 days ago, as we all now know, around 200 ballistic missiles were fired from Iran with very little warning towards Israel. This was the night before Rosh Hashanah, if I remember correctly, the Jewish New Year, causing pretty much everyone in Israel to go into bomb shelters, not just for 5 or 10 minutes, as many previous attacks from the north, south, or east, but for a good part of an hour. Not as many of the rockets were shot down as the first time in April, I think it was, but there was still relatively minimal damage caused and very little loss of life. The only loss of life that was publicized was a Palestinian from Gaza who happened to be in Jericho at the time, and shrapnel from the shooting down of one of the missiles landed right on his head. But as we know, Israel has threatened a response. Pretty much everyone from the Prime Minister down has said that there will be a response. But the question that a lot of people are asking is when or why is it taking so long? And these things take time. We've got to remember this is not Gaza. This is not Khan Yunis. This is not Ramallah. This is not Beirut. It's a complicated operation. It needs refueling at least once, if not twice, I think, on the way, which limits it. It's not going to be a constant barrage as Israel is able to achieve in Gaza or Beirut, with lots of sorties going across quite frequently. This is a more complicated, complex operation. And the question that keeps on going around is exactly what kind of response it will be. So I'll take through maybe three possible targets, let's say. And we know from leaks and people involved that these are the three main areas that are under consideration. The first one is purely military positions, perhaps those rocket launching areas that launch the rockets against Israel, perhaps against the Revolutionary Guards, perhaps against other significant military personnel, perhaps against defensive measures to make sure that Israel has more possibility to get through unscathed in the future. The second one is more civilian targets to target the regime and specifically the economy. As we know, the Iranian economy is in tatters and it's really teetering on the brink. So there are suggestions that attacking Iran's gas or oil industry would be a severe blow that would take it really to the brink, perhaps allowing maybe the people to rise up. That's something that's been suggested not just within Israel, but even within Iran. There's all these reports from Iranian opposition figures who are calling for such types of targets. And the final one, the one that's most debated in Israel, is whether this is the opportunity to target part of Iran's nuclear weapons industry. That would be perhaps arguably the most strategic target, especially as we know from reports that Iran is already into the weaponization aspect of the nuclear program, and probably could result in at least one nuclear armed missile within 2 years. There are some who say that there is no greater opportunity than now to target Iran's nuclear program, knowing that there is legitimacy, or at least a certain amount of international legitimacy, certain amount of understanding. Israel has a right to target And perhaps this is the time. It would be very difficult to completely destroy Iran's nuclear program, as we know, for all various reasons, that parts of it we may not all know about. Parts of it are deep down in bunkers with which Israel may not have the necessary size bombs. There is a debate about that, whether we do, whether America have given Israel the necessary bombs, whether it can be more of a cluster targeting the type that took out Hassan Nasrallah, or something like that. Each of these targets comes with advantages and disadvantages and major considerations. And we know that all of these are being discussed, not just in Israel, but by allies, whether it's the US, Europe, but also in the region. Iran has threatened many times in the region to target some of its Sunni neighbors. Perhaps that's part of why MBS today was meeting with the Iranian foreign minister to try and get some sort of guarantee from him that Saudi Arabia won't be targeted if Israel should target Iran. But all of these things are very much in play, and all of these countries are sending different messages to Israel to try and not necessarily dictate, but certainly give its point of view and advise on exactly what Israel should do. It does seem, again, just from the noise around it, that possibly or probably the military component is leading at this point, but these things can change for reasons completely unknown to us. And obviously there are many different opinions within the cabinet. There are those who are more hawkish. There's even members of the Likud who say that this is the time completely to eradicate the Iranian nuclear program, and Israel has to do everything until that happens. But obviously there are more, I wouldn't say necessarily dovish viewpoints, but those who say, who basically argue to continue what can be described as a phased approach. Let's not forget, since October 7th last year, Israel very much focused on Gaza for a good 10 months, even though Hezbollah were rocketing and targeting the north of Israel since October 8th, the next day. Israel really didn't face Hezbollah until the last couple of months. It really wanted to try and focus as much as possible into defeating Hamas, really grinding it down as much as possible. And only when it felt that it had done that to a very large extent did it start facing north. And now, with the tremendous successes and achievements against Hezbollah, Israel still has a lot to do there. It's clear that Hezbollah still has capability. It was pounding the north today. At least 2 Israelis were killed, and many, many more, were injured with attacks in places like Kiryat Shmona, Haifa, Tzfat, and other places. So Israel is definitely winning that war, but it hasn't finished. And perhaps it feels that if it takes on Iran too strongly, it can distract from its war against Hezbollah and force it to basically fight on too many fronts, which will allow many of these enemies and terrorist organizations, or the ultimate terror state itself, Iran, to recoup its losses and be able to fight in a stronger way. The irony here that's not lost on a lot of people is Netanyahu has built much of his political career, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, on saying, I am the person who is going to stop the Iranian nuclear weapons program. He has basically banked his career. That's his vision. Many people have written about it, that is his obsession, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why they didn't go after Hamas as strongly as they should have. Perhaps that's one of the reasons why Hezbollah was allowed to arm itself to the teeth right on Israel's border for so many years. The argument was that we have to keep our focus on Iran. Perhaps that's where exactly it was on October 7th and things like that. So the fact that now it seems that Bibi has changed his mind, or at least, let's say, circumstances has forced him to change it, that he's now going for a phased approach and actually putting Iran last, it seems. Again, we'll have to wait to see what the response, but it does seem that Hamas, was first on this, Hezbollah is certainly second, and Iran at this point is probably not a war he wants to start at this point. Obviously, as I said, the other considerations are exactly how other nations are seeing it. Interestingly, tonight, for the first time in a number of weeks since at least August, there was a direct phone call between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu. It largely focused on what Israel's response would be to Iran. And again, the Americans have got to a point where they understand that they can't dictate to Israel, because they feel that when they have done and Israel's gone ahead with it, then they've lost political clout. So now they're in a stage where they're more advising Israel strongly and trying to steer them in a particular direction rather than saying you shouldn't do this or shouldn't do that. It's clear that Israel went against American advice on many occasions, whether it was in Rafah. We remember Americans said, do not go into Rafah. There's too many civilians there. There's no way you can fight there without a massive civilian catastrophe. Israel was able to actually deal with that and get the overwhelming majority of civilians away from Rafah and basically take it with not too much loss of life. It was certainly not too much civilian loss of life. And the achievements it's made in the north with Hezbollah has certainly put the Americans a little bit, the American administration, a little bit on the back foot, knowing that to advise that it can't do something when it's been proven wrong on a number of occasions, and B, when it has said to the Israeli government not to do something and it's done it anyway, it's now understood that its position is a little bit more tenuous, so it's trying to guide and advise and steer and suggest rather than outright dictate. Part of the reason why this conversation took place is not just to understand where Israel is regarding Iran, where it is regarding Hezbollah and Hamas, but also apparently because Gallant, Israel's defense minister, was supposed to go for a 24-hour whirlwind trip to the US to meet with many of the senior figures, including his counterpart, Austin. And apparently he was told not to leave by Netanyahu until Netanyahu had that conversation, which it was clear that Biden did not want to have this conversation, but perhaps it was the threat that Gallant would not be able to go to the US that made this conversation happen tonight. Moving a little bit more closely into looking what's going on the northern border, some remarkable things have happened over the last few days, diplomatically and politically, I should say, as well as militarily. But what has come out over the last few days is a real U-turn by Hezbollah. Since the beginning of the war, they've really tied their future and their operations to what's going on in Gaza. They've said that we are only targeting Israel just to try and help our brothers and sisters in Gaza and the Palestinians, to try and distract the Israeli army, to try and inflict some wounds on Israel as it goes after Hamas. And it's said on many, many, many occasions that it will not consider stopping until that there's a ceasefire in Gaza. For the first time this week, we heard the most senior members, and let's not forget, most of the former senior members of Hezbollah have been taken out, including Hassan Nasrallah himself, and according to Netanyahu, his replacement and his replacement's replacement. So we saw a very apologetic, I can't remember his name, but one of the leaders of Hezbollah in a very apologetic speech, basically saying that we are ready for a ceasefire. Again, not explicitly, but very implicitly, and saying that he will support the Lebanese government's calls for a ceasefire, which is quite extraordinary that now Hezbollah seem pretty desperate for a ceasefire, which shows that Israel is certainly doing quite a job on Hezbollah and pounding it into really seeking this unconditional ceasefire. The other interesting thing about what's going on in Hezbollah is this position now, which apparently is enunciated by the head of the Mossad, Barnea, who basically thinks that the only way to get to a hostage deal at this point is to pressure Lebanon through military action, and perhaps even to have a strong response. Usually, some of the security forces are against such a strong response, but to things like Iran. But apparently, there is a belief now, let's put it that way, that the stronger the threat against Beirut and Tehran is, the more possibility that there is that the leadership in Beirut and the leadership in Tehran will go to Hamas, will go to Sinwar, maybe Khaled Mashal, and say to him, enough. You've got to go for the ceasefire. That's the key to everything that's going on, because there are discussions now, largely without Israel at this point, apparently behind sort of the scenes between Iran and the US to try and achieve some sort of holistic ceasefire, which would include all the different fronts, including Yemen and Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Gaza. But obviously, Israel would have to be very much part of that. At the moment, Israel is very much buoyed by its achievements in Lebanon and wants to continue, pushing Hezbollah back. According to, I think, one US expert, Israel has pushed Hezbollah back 20 years. It's clear that that threat is dissipating, and perhaps that's why Iran is getting more and more angry, because that is its main proxy and that was its main deterrent against Israel, and it's dwindling very much, and that's perhaps another reason for this now talk about some sort of holistic ceasefire. The problem is again, as it has been since the beginning, is Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, today, not just the military leader, but also the political leader, since Haniyeh was assassinated. And he still believes in the possibility of a regional war. So perhaps he has to hear it straight from his to a certain extent, paymasters in Tehran and allies in Beirut to say, okay, enough. You now need to go for a hostage deal, because he still believes that there is a possibility of this all-out regional war, which is something that he's hoped for since the beginning. So we'll have to see how that's playing out. On top of the incessant attacks from Iraq, from Yemen, from the north, from Hezbollah, from Hamas, even on the anniversary of the massacre last year, and even Iran, now we're seeing a real spate of suicide attacks within Israel. We saw one today in Hadera, we saw one the other day in Beersheba, and what's interesting about it is it seems to be perpetrated largely by Israelis. There are some Palestinians involved, but at least two of the recent attacks were perpetrated by Israeli citizens, Israeli Arab citizens. And Israel's response is possibly going to be unprecedented. Israel has had a policy of demolishing homes of terrorists in the Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, in the past, but it is now asking for the first time ever to be able to demolish the home of a homegrown terrorist, of an Israeli citizen, and even has called for, and apparently there's a law on this very issue winding its way through the Knesset, to revoke the citizenship of the family. The family, the terrorist perpetrated the attack in Beersheba the other day. Their family has a history of terrorism. I believe their cousin did a terror attack exactly in the same place a number of years ago. So there is a strong case, and it'll be very interesting, because this will be unprecedented if these measures are taken against an Israeli citizen. Finally, before we go to questions, so I've gone over time a little bit, the enlistment issue again is rearing its head. The ultra-Orthodox parties are demanding again that this issue be dealt with before the Knesset, or when the Knesset returns towards the end of the month. And especially the United Torah Judaism, the Ashkenazi Haredi party, has basically said that we will not even discuss the budget, which needs to be passed by the third month of next year, or the government automatically dissolves, without a law. And the religious or spiritual leader of the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox public came out today and said, we do not agree on one single ultra-Orthodox student or person being drafted. So doesn't seem like they're ready to compromise on their side. We'll have to wait and see exactly what happens, but that's certainly a headache that Netanyahu probably feels he doesn't need at this point. But to go over to the ultra-Orthodox position at this point will certainly create a lot of anger within general Israeli society after a year of the army being stretched to its limit, and many Israelis doing service, not working, not being with their families, and then witnessing a whole community basically given a blanket exemption from being part of the army would certainly be considered by many to be a poke in the eye at this point. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the update, Ashley. I will start with this question. Iran recently received new surface-to-air missile defense systems from Russia, namely the S-400 system. Do you think that would affect Israel's ability to attack Iran against and retaliate for the missile attack?
Well, certainly the S-300s. There was an episode a number of years ago where there was talk of the S-300s coming across to Iran, and that was considered a bit of a game changer in Israel in the ability of Israel to fly over and be able to bomb targets should it need to. So certainly any sort of upping of the defensive abilities against Israeli planes would certainly be considered hugely problematic and hugely challenging. But what Israel did show in its response in April, even though it was a relatively, well, not relatively, it was an extremely mild response at the time, was that Israel could get in and out of Iran. It could get through Iranian radar, could get through Iranian defenses, and attack pretty much wherever it wanted. It actually went quite far into Iran, really to send that message to the Ayatollahs to show that it could get through completely unscathed, could bomb wherever it wanted. It only, as I said, chose a relatively mild response, targeting, I think, just one or two places, and then getting out completely unscathed. So it's certainly a challenge. It's a greater challenge for Israel, but Israel has so far in its history tried to and successfully stayed ahead of any technological advances by its enemies. And I'm sure there's a certain amount of confidence that it'll be able to do so again, even though there is certainly a drive and an attempt to up Iranian defenses.
Thank you. Now, in addition to the possibility that Israel targets Iran's oil fields or their nuclear facilities, how likely is it that the Israelis will target the supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei himself?
I see that as probably unlikely at this point, because that would be obviously considered, casus belli for all-out war. And as I said, I don't think Israel wants that at this point. I think it wants to focus on the north. It wants to focus on its stated war aims, which is in the south, defeating Hamas, making sure it does not regroup, but in the north, making sure that the tens of thousands of Israelis can return to their homes. Those are relatively limited war aims, and to target Iran in such a way would probably shift attention and not allow them, to immediately or in the near future to achieve those war aims, because obviously it would have to focus a lot more on Iran. So I think that's why the response has to be that sort of middle ground between not wanting to get into an all-out daily back and forth with Iran, but also send it a very strong message of deterrence. Yes, you've now targeted us twice. The first time our response was relatively minimal, but it won't be this time, because you've got to know that there will be a response. You can't just target another sovereign country openly and with very little ramifications. We know from Iran's diplomatic response that they're even nervous about it, because they claimed again and again that their attack was legitimate under UN charter. It was a defensive operation that only targeted military targets, etc., etc. So Iran is trying very much to also find that middle ground where it can be seen as sending Israel a message without going too far. So probably at this point, again, we'll have to wait and see exactly, but it does seem that the indications are that Israel also wants to find somewhere in that middle ground. Again, things could go wrong, things could get out of hand, or it could be that Israel sees an opportunity which it feels it just cannot ignore at this point. Perhaps this is the one opportunity, or maybe not the only opportunity, but a major opportunity to push the Iranian nuclear program back sufficiently, a few years. It's unlikely that they'll be able to completely destroy it, but even if they push it back a year or two, that could give it a lot more time for other possible circumstances. So I think that's probably where Israel is looking at the moment, but we'll have to wait and see. Probably it won't happen while Gallant is in the US, although, let's be honest, last time a senior Israeli official, namely Prime Minister Netanyahu, was in the US, they took up Nasrallah. So one never knows. And let's not forget the relationship between Defense Minister Gallant and Prime Minister Netanyahu is very low. Gallant is not in every single defensive or security meeting and consideration. So perhaps that is going to be the foil, but I don't think the Americans would see that too much. One thing for Netanyahu to go and speak at the UN, it's another thing for it to do a major attack while Gallant is in a meeting with Defense Secretary Austin. We'll have to wait and see.
Right, thank you. Now, you touched on this a little bit earlier about the likelihood of Iranians potentially rising up against their government. In such a case, how do you imagine the West and Israel and other Arab countries would respond to that?
Well, it's interesting because I think that for the first time in history, an Israeli prime minister addressed, or at least since the Islamic Revolution in 79, an Israeli prime minister openly sent a message to the Iranian people. Perhaps I'm pretty sure in the past a prime minister and president have sent New Year's Nowruz, I think it's called, greetings. But what was unique about this is actually he almost did call for the Iranian people to rise up and say, we're with you. And if you do that together, we can bring down this regime. Again, he didn't say that explicitly, but very much implicitly. So perhaps there is a feeling within the Israeli government that perhaps this can be part of the story. The fact that there is a significant, and it's impossible to know exactly how significant, but a significant number of Iranians who are ready to overthrow the regime. The Americans are very nervous about what this could mean. And they're not, as they've stated many, many times, they're not in favor of regime change. Interestingly, and to go in a bit of another direction, there is talk that the Americans, because of what Israel is doing in Lebanon, it is actually maybe trying to see this as an opportunity to push more moderate elements. Lebanon hasn't had I think it's a president or prime minister for a long time, and there is a feeling that the US and the West in general is taking advantage or using this opportunity to push more moderate elements at the expense of the more extremist Hezbollah and other Shiite movements. So perhaps I don't see US as being on board with any sort of regime change at this point. But again, as we've seen in Lebanon, perhaps if something were to happen, perhaps it would assist or push behind the scenes. But I don't think that that's anything that they're considering at this point.
Thank you. Now, here's a question from Murray Feldman, who asks, is the Israeli desire for a border now the Awali River and not the Litani River any longer?
Again, that's not a stated war aim. The stated war aim is to ensure that the tens of thousands of Israelis in the north can return to their homes. How that looks exactly, we don't know. What we do know is that Israel has made tremendous gains in southern Lebanon. Interestingly, we just saw a report comparing what Israel is doing, what Israel is able to do in the south of Lebanon, as opposed to the Second Lebanon War in, I think it was 2006, where it faced massive resistance, a lot of guerrilla fighting as soon as it went over the border, which we simply just don't see. Again, there's only really been one major attack on Israeli soldiers, and that was because there was a unit that when it went in, it was attacked by a mortar, I think it was, and one of the soldiers unfortunately was blown to bits. But they didn't know that at the time. They thought that maybe he was kidnapped, so they went after the Hezbollah unit, and there was a big firefight, and unfortunately, I think 7 Israeli soldiers lost their life. But apart from that, not to say it's been a walk in the park, of course not, war never is, but certainly not the resistance that they saw in the Second Lebanon War. And that's largely because of the good work that the Air Force and Special Commando units had been doing in the months previous to that. So it's clear that Israel wants to try and push on as much as possible, try and clear the area immediately from the border. It's finding tunnels, it's finding all sorts of rocket systems, hidden Hezbollah centers and everything else. And probably until there's a serious attempted a ceasefire until Israel's felt that it's done enough to return its citizens to their homes. Israel will continue. It's buoyed by its achievements, and I think the international community understands at this point that there's really very little hope or much to be gained by stopping Israel at this point, because it's simply doing what it says it would, and with very little loss of civilian life, even though Lebanon, again, is not Gaza, and the international community will not really stomach as much damage to the infrastructure of a sovereign country as it would Gaza. But at the moment, Israel has shown no appetite and no signs of letting up at this point.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ashley. We have unfortunately reached the end of this week's podcast. I want to thank you again for taking the time to update us this week.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Of course. And for our viewers and listeners, please be on the lookout over the weekend in your email inboxes for our forthcoming MEF podcast episodes. We thank you all again for joining us and for your continued participation, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks.